This is Speaking of Pets podcast, where we offer you up-to-date, science-based, accurate information.
Oh, Gizmo! Good kitty. You're such a good kitty.
And they're looking up and howling in unison.
If it affects pets, we'll talk about it. The Speaking of Pets podcast is sponsored by Blue Buffalo Veterinary Diets. Love them like family, feed them like family. Hi everyone, welcome to Speaking of Pets. I'm Dr. Alice Novotny-Jeroman, a board-certified veterinary dermatologist. My lovely co-host, Janet Novotny-King, will not be with us today. She has a prior engagement, but she'll be back next week, and that'll be a lot of fun. We have been getting so many questions about backyard chickens. Do they make good pets? What do I need to feed them? What about the bird flu? What's the latest? So we went right to the source. Dr. Maurice Pitesky is an associate professor of cooperative extension at UC Davis College of Veterinary Medicine with an appointment in poultry health and food safety epidemiology. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Biology from UCLA and his veterinary degree and his Master's of Preventative Veterinary Medicine from UC Davis. So he is our go-to person to ask about keeping chickens as pets, what's the latest in bird flu, everything we wanted to know about backyard poultry. Thanks, Dr. Pitesky, for being here today. We have so many questions from viewers about having chickens as pets, and I thought, as I told our viewers earlier, I'm going right to the source to ask you a million chicken questions that people have submitted. So please bear with us.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Anyway, how popular are backyard chickens? I mean, is this like a current rage all over the country or certain regions?
Yeah, so as far as like we know we know anecdotally that backyard chickens are very popular, and that they're kind of having a moment over the last decade or so. We don't know exactly how many there are. So I'm from California. If you do some of the back of the envelope calculations, you usually get to a number around 100,000 different backyard premises throughout the state. And we have a climate that's probably conducive to that. We have a large population. You can kind of sort of extrapolate. There's been a few studies that have been done throughout the country in kind of backyard poultry hotbeds. So Los Angeles, Miami, a couple other urban areas. So it's popular. What's happened recently with egg prices has seemed to kind of cause increased interest. We're in the springtime. That's when people usually purchase chicks, people that already have backyard birds. So all those things have kind of combined to probably kind of peak interest at this point in backyard poultry for all kinds of reasons, including now some economic reasons because of egg prices.
Well, that's kind of why I also wanted to interview you, because I think people think, oh my gosh, eggs are so expensive, I can just get a couple of chickens and put them in the backyard. And there's really more to it than that. And I hope that people respect that. I'm from Ohio. I'm in Florida right now, but some of my friends in Ohio have pet chickens. I mean, they sit on their shoulder. And also, I kind of a funny story. I went with a friend to, anyway, she sells antique bamboo furniture, and it's out in the country here in Florida. And when I got there was a rooster there, and the owner of the bamboo shop was following it around with a tennis racket because apparently it attacks people. I mean, is that a common thing? The roosters are mean or no?
So this is all the nuance that you're kind of alluding to. So it's obviously, as I think many of your listeners, but maybe not everyone realizes, it's not as simple as just putting your chickens in the backyard and just waiting for the eggs to start coming. I think chickens are relatively low maintenance, and kind of to your point, if you're just purchasing eggs just for economic reasons, you're probably going to maybe be in a little over your head as far as the time investment. They're relatively easy to raise, but they do take some effort and knowledge and purpose and things like that, or else you're going to kind of get yourself in a pickle at some level. Roosters, to your specific question, yeah, roosters can be very aggressive. There's nothing wrong with having a rooster in a flock. Actually, it kind of helps with flock dynamics in some situations. They can be protective of predators. But I think, as we all kind of intuitively know, roosters can be loud. So many urban areas have noise ordinances and rules against roosters. So we have a problem in the backyard poultry world. When you order your chicks from any kind of source, they're sexed. So you typically, most backyard people want eggs. Obviously, roosters don't produce eggs. So roosters are not as valuable. In many cases, actually, they're undesirable because of the noise, for example, and because of how aggressive they can be in certain situations. So because of that, people are kind of, I would say, pretty consistently, emailing me or calling me saying what can they do with their roosters. And the reason, the reality is that even when you order your chicks, when they sex them, they can be wrong every once in a while. I mean, the ability for them to sex them is actually really amazing. You're talking over 99% in most cases, but it's not perfect. And every once in a while you get a rooster and no one really knows what to do with them in a backyard world. In a commercial world, those roosters will be euthanized in the laying world, because they're not productive in that point, unless we're on a breeding farm and we need to hatch genetic stock and things like that.
Well, not to get too technical, but for my own edification, how do they do the sexing of the
Yeah,
chicks?
it's actually I can't do it. It's usually done by it's done still by humans for the most part. We do know, just like in the dairy industry, we can actually sex the semen, and then use artificial insemination. The economics of that don't work out yet for the most part, so it's still done by humans, and I believe it's just historically, for some reason, I think it's the Hmong and the Vietnamese women that typically have kind of flocked, no pun intended, to this kind of specific niche of the poultry industry, and they're amazing at it. Like, I've seen them do it, and they try to show me how to do it, and I'm like, I didn't feel anything. There are some breeds which are sexed, in the sense that they have physical characteristics which you can see, and then you'll know if they're male or female based on feather colors and things like that. Those are great, but those are not really the commercial breeds. The great part about backyard poultry, though, is that there's literally hundreds of breeds of backyard chickens, and people can be very deliberate about which breeds they want to select for, because of behavior, feathers, sexing, all those type of things. So the hatchery will do everything for you, but it's usually they'll kind of feel and palpate around the cloaca, and they can feel some of the anatomy. And in all honesty, I'm pretty ignorant of what they feel for. It's kind of a niche area.
I'm chuckling because the old TV show from the 50s, What's My Line? And then they would have guests on, and they would show you, the audience, what the occupation was. And could you imagine? Chicken sexer. They would never guess that. I'm curious, and this isn't one of the questions that our viewers ask, but I'm just curious myself. So all these different breeds of chickens, the eggs they lay, do they taste different? I mean, you know what I mean? I'm sure they look different, because my friends that have pet chickens, they give me some really adorable eggs.
Yeah, so interesting kind of, so there are these kind of breeds, like Americanas, for example, that have produced these kind of bluish eggs on the shell. And
yes.
The dogma is that the color of the ears correlates with the egg color. So when you're looking at like Rhode Island Reds, they've got brown ears, so they'll make these beautiful kind of tannish brownish shells, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing, so when you look at the commercial poultry industry, there's just a few breeds that the commercial folks will use, because they're looking for the ones that are going to produce the most amount of eggs every single year for the least amount of feed. Where it gets really, I think, fascinating and fun is when you look at the backyard folks and all the different breeds of chickens they have. So my personal favorite are the Polish breeds, because they just look kind of almost like Albert Einstein type of hen. And they're just
Cool.
quirky looking. They all have slightly different behaviors. There's the bantams, which are a little smaller. So people, kind of the backyard folks will usually recommend bantams for families with young children, for example. And you want to obviously stay away from roosters, just in a general sense, around young children. And to that point, around young children, I think the CDC recommends that if you're under 10, that you shouldn't be kind of handling birds because they have a tendency to touch their mouths and eyes and conjunctiva. These birds, can be natural carriers of salmonella, among other bacteria. But the sky's the limit. There are literally hundreds of breeds, and when you think about chickens when they were originally domesticated, 7 to 10,000 years ago in the Indus Valley in India, they were originally domesticated for fighting, in our culture that's on the no list. If you go to other parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America, that's still culturally acceptable, and there's parts of the United States where those things still percolate. But I guess my point is they're originally bred for fighting and also for the beautiful feathers that they had. And over thousands of years, we've domesticated and selected for and created hundreds of breeds. And there's just some amazing choices for people to have as far as all the different feathers and things like that. The one thing, when people are just interested in eggs, that could be part of your motivation for selecting a breed. Like a Rhode Island Red is almost like the Toyota Camry, I guess, of laying hens. And then when you start getting to some of these quirkier breeds, you might get some beautiful feathers and some really interesting eggs, but you won't get as many eggs, and the productivity will be a little decreased. But obviously that's not the main motivation for many people that have backyard chickens.
What, off the top of your head, what breed is like the friendliest, like that you would get with little kids? Not little kids, but children, that you wouldn't worry about them getting pecked.
People like the bantams, and the bantams are basically just the smaller version of each breed. Most chickens are just really, really nice. The only breed I've ever really heard of people having problems with, there's a breed that's Egyptian called Fayumi, and they're actually really interesting because they have some disease resistance to a disease called coccidia, among other kind of diseases. So they're kind of interesting from a scientific perspective. But I've heard that they can be a little flighty, a little aggressive. That being said, I mean, a flighty, aggressive hen, compared to, other animals, like, you might think about, dog breeds or things like that sometimes can be aggressive around kids. I don't worry about that too much. I would say it's really important to respect roosters, though. Roosters can be very aggressive, and every once in a while you actually hear about someone actually dying from being attacked by a rooster. It's probably a fighting bird, and those birds, they will go for your jugular. I was on a ranch recently, trying to find some information about fighting birds for a different project, and I was kind of ignorant of how aggressive they can be, and the bird was tied to a post, and it actually jumped at me. And it was like going for my neck, and I was far enough away, but I was also like, okay, I totally get how someone could have been attacked and even killed by these roosters. That's a very rare situation. Roosters in general aren't that way. They will be a little aggressive, though, and I think the noise issue is probably the biggest issue that folks deal with.
Yeah.
Hey, did you know that Blue Buffalo makes prescription diets that are formulated by animal nutritionists and veterinarians? And they're used for dietary needs such as kidney support, gastrointestinal support, weight management, and our favorite, allergy and skin problems.
They make a food allergic diet that's an alligator based called NP, or a hydrolyzed salmon based for dogs and cats called HF.
So please ask your veterinarian about Blue Buffalo prescription diets.
Well, and speaking of the noise issue, wouldn't you recommend that if you're going to get backyard chickens, you need to check with zoning? Like here, I know in Sanibel, there's no way I could have a backyard chicken. I mean, it would be the news of the island,
So every city, or most cities, do have rules, and it's important to look at those ordinances. Usually, what they're trying to control for is noise and smell. Um, Now, one thing
Yeah.
I tell people is that you can have one. Well, you really don't want to have one chicken because they're social animals and they need to be around others. But you can literally have two or three, whatever's within the ordinance. And if you don't do a good job, you'll have some odor issues and even sometimes some noise issues. So you want to practice good husbandry in addition to following those rules, and then you won't have neighbors that are complaining to you.
So is there a pecking order? Is there like a caste system for chickens, for
I like
females?
the term caste.
I'm
Yeah,
sure
there
with the
absolutely is. There's ways to kind of mitigate that. Some of that's just their natural behavior. But for example, if I've got 10 birds and I only have enough feed for 5 of them, and enough water for 5 of them as far as space and what I'm allowing them, absolutely they will really
Yeah.
devolve into that kind of, I like your term, caste system. There's ways to mitigate that though, right? So if we make sure that there's enough feeders for all of our birds, we make sure there's enough perch space for all of our birds, enough water, et cetera, et cetera. And by doing that, we can mitigate, kind of any kind of aggressive behavior that might ensure from limited resources.
I was just thinking socially of, I'm retired, and sometimes when I go to these group functions, there's little, how can I say, just little groups that this one doesn't have anything to do with that one, this one doesn't have anything to do with that one. And I'm thinking, okay, so provided they have enough food and water, and you've got maybe 10 hens, and I'm bringing a new one in, could that be a disaster? I mean, socially, not with the food and water.
So
like, do you have to be careful?
yeah, so a couple things, because that's a very common situation where someone will have, their flock, and then somehow they'll want to introduce
Clicks.
Yeah,
they have
they'll
clicks.
have clicks, and then you're bringing something new into that flock. So that's a very common kind of scenario because just the way backyard birds ownership kind of works. They see a hen and they want another bird, all that kind of stuff. So long story short, I think first of all, you want to quarantine any new birds that you have because you don't know.
I read that. It said quarantine for 30 days. Is
Yeah,
that
so
true?
I always say, people that say 30 days, you're hoping that they do 10 or 15 days. The whole goal is to quarantine them long enough. So I would say at least 7 to 10 days to where that the birds aren't having any GI problems or respiratory problems, any kind of infectious diseases that you might be bringing into your flock. So that's the whole goal there of the quarantine. And a lot of people don't follow that. Now, the next challenge is when you bring those new birds into your flock, what's behaviorally going to go on? Because we're going to basically be resetting the caste or the pecking order.
Right.
And in that scenario, there can be challenges too. Again, ways to mitigate that are by offering enough feed and water and perch space. Some people...
Like, calm down, don't worry, there's enough for everybody.
Some people have suggested, adding new enrichments at the same time, so adding like a bale of hay just to distract everyone from the new birds. Some people have anecdotally suggested, if you put them in at night when all the birds are sleeping, in the morning, they don't seem to be as observant, and they just kind of shrug their shoulders a little. The only problem with that is, like, if that's not the result, then you just need to keep a close eye so you can separate the birds out. Ideally, getting birds of about the same size is going to mitigate that. So that's probably an important factor.
That's complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it just goes to show you how much emotion that any animal has. Bird, and I don't think humans respect that.
I agree. It's kind of interesting. I don't think we always appreciate how much our kind of partners that we're living with, how much they know, whether they're wild animals, whether they're domesticated animals.
Right.
They're probably a lot smarter than we give them credit for. To your point.
Are the main diseases that they get then upper respiratory and gastrointestinal? I mean, if I have a flock, what do I kind of need to keep my eye out for?
Yeah, so the biggest disease that kind of backyarders typically deal with, which is actually 100% or 99.9% preventable, is a virus called Marek's disease, and it's a herpes virus, and we have a very good vaccine for it. The challenge is the vaccine can only be given for it to be effective at day of age, right when the chick hatches, because the herpes virus is considered ubiquitous in the environment, so our chicks are being exposed to it right when they hatch. So the reality is that most, if not almost all, backyard birds are not vaccinated against Marek's disease. The commercial poultry industry, to their credit, does vaccinate, and it's actually very effective at
Is that oral or injectable?
It's an injectable. It's very easy to give. We have a YouTube video that we've that our lab has made at UC Davis to show how that vaccine can be given. But it has to be given a day of age. Like if you give it at day 2, it's not like your chicken's going to turn into a pumpkin or anything, but it just won't be as effective. So there's 2 ways to kind of handle that. One, you do it yourself at day of age. The other is to deal with hatcheries and feed stores that will vaccinate. So if me, Maurice Pitesky from UC Davis, tells the hatcheries, hey, you guys should vaccinate against Marek's, they're going to shrug their shoulders because I'm not their customer. But if your listeners start putting pressure and start saying, look, I'm not buying your birds unless you vaccinate them at day of age, then they'll start kind of moving in that direction. And that's been a challenge, right? Like that's the number one cause of backyard poultry mortality. There's no cure for it, not even apple cider vinegar, which for some reason seems to be the panacea for everything in kind of many animals.
I drank that as a kid because my mother was into natural hygiene, so I know all about apple cider vinegar. It has to have the mother in it.
I didn't realize it was that, kind of.
It's that crap that floats in the bottom.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. But it is. That's one disease we can make a huge impact on. And then the other thing that people should know is that the virus is in the highest concentration in the feather follicle. So if I have chicks and I'm putting them eventually from the brooder into the coop, even if they're vaccinated, I don't want to put, obviously, after I've had a vaccine, I don't want to go into an area with a bunch of flu or COVID or whatever. I want to reduce the amount that's in the environment around me. So same thing with Marek. So you vaccinate against Marek's, and then when you introduce your birds, vaccinated birds into the flock, you want to get rid of all those feather follicles. So you've reduced the amount of virus in the environment that they're exposed to. So those are the 2 things you can do to reduce the probability of your birds getting Marek's, and there is no cure for Marek's, unfortunately.
And for our viewers, Marek's is not contagious to humans. No,
it is not contagious to humans. For humans, the big issue that we deal with chickens is salmonella, Campylobacter, and now, unfortunately, we're 100% we're dealing with highly pathogenic avian influenza. There was a senior who was healthy otherwise that actually recently died from exposure to high path AI from their backyard chickens in Louisiana. So it's a serious thing.
Oh. And I just read yesterday that 3 cat owners are suing the raw diet that their cats were being fed. They're suing that company, claiming that the diet said it was safe. And I get that. And their cats died. But I also get that as a pet owner, I think, and that's the purpose of this podcast, you need to search out accurate science-based information. I mean, there's a lot of things that raw diet carries. And as of late, that's one of them.
Like, I did not realize that was a thing, that people were giving their domestic cats raw turkey. And I would be very concerned about all kinds of diseases in addition to avian influenza. So that is not, I know this is a controversial topic, but just because we did this 10,000 years ago doesn't mean we should be doing it right now. There is a significant risk. And the problem with doing that with cats is that cats get very close to your face. And we have seen on many dairies a lot of feral cats dying from exposure to contaminated milk. And while we haven't had that situation happen in human, cats are mammals, we're mammals. This virus has an amazing capacity to reassort and mutate, and the connecting of the dots from an infected cat to an infected human, or infected milk to a susceptible human is not a very big leap. So it's, even though it hasn't happened yet, I'm not the kind of person that I want to wait until 10 people get infected with high path AI from raw milk or from their cats eating raw turkey before I say, hey, we shouldn't do this anymore. We know that that's a very high probability event. Has not happened yet as far as we know, but it is not a leap to assume that will happen at some point.
And you know, the more I read about this, the more it looks like cats are really the canary in the coal mine on these dairy farms. You know, once these cats are starting to die, it's very sad for that purpose, but it's trying to tell us something.
And the cats are probably getting exposed to a couple routes. The raw milk, their cats are great hunters, so cats are on farms for a good reason, even though that's not technically allowed, but they're very good at catching rodents, and they're very good at scaring away birds. And those are two things that can carry other diseases into these dairies and poultry facilities. So there's other ways we do that now, but cats are actually, you know, as someone who's been on a lot of farms and talked to a lot of farmers, cats are actually really good at what they do, and they can be very protective. There's challenges with that, but there's actually a lot of value in what a cat can provide. But that's on a farm. By having cats domestically exposed to all kinds of diseases, we're kind of the kind of while they're the canary in the coal mine, to your point, we can potentially be kind of the person that's most susceptible to being exposed to various diseases. So the raw turkey thing, to me, is a risk that has no value to it as far as exposing our pets, our loved ones, to those kind of diseases.
I was also reading that the virus seems to attach. It has more receptors in cats to the lung tissue and the neuro, and respiratory and neurology. It's fascinating to me that, you know, first of all, how different cats are from dogs and the other species we deal with, but they're so more sensitive to so many certain things.
Blue Buffalo natural veterinary diets offer a natural alternative in nutritional therapy. With their in-house research and development team with over 300 years experience in well pet and veterinary therapeutic diets, more than 600 scientific publications, and more than 50 U.S. patents. Blue Buffalo natural veterinary diets.
So just the highly pathogenic avian influenza virus is this version of it that we're dealing with right now globally is incredible in its ability to affect wild birds, domestic birds, wild mammals, domestic mammals. We're finding it in human wastewater. We're finding it in lagoons and wetlands. It is ubiquitous. In my opinion, we're dealing with an endemic virus at this point that we're going to have to learn to live with. But it is extraordinary in how it's moved. You know, if we were talking 3 years ago, we would talk about wild waterfowl and we would talk about poultry. And now we're talking about cats and dogs and albatross and sea lions and dairy cows. And it's incredible what is going on. We've never seen anything like this as far as any infectious disease, in my opinion.
Is France, I read that France is the only one vaccinating. They're vaccinating ducks. But is that for this flu or just flu in general?
Yeah, so the French are vaccinating their duck population, and you know, French cuisine, they eat more ducks probably than we do in the United States. So and ducks are highly susceptible. They're domestic waterfowl. There are other countries that vaccinate, so China, Vietnam, Egypt. So there is some Mexico. There is some data out there on how vaccination could work, how it could be useful, but there's a lot of politics and science that's kind of driving the bus in the United States. So we're still kind of trying to figure out where vaccination could potentially fit in. But yes, the French do vaccinate. It's an injection. And I believe they have to give it twice. And the
Oh.
logistics of that in the United States would be very hard. We're the largest exporter and poultry producer in the world, or the top three, depending on how you look at it. But we produce about 8 billion broilers a year. We have over 300 million laying hens, hundreds of millions of turkeys. If we're going to do this, we need to be strategic about it, because I think the logistics of doing all those birds would be very challenging, and for multiple reasons, including just the actual vaccination.
Right. Is there any way, since the wild bird population can expose backyard chickens to this, is there any way to really keep where you're housing these chickens out of wild bird exposure? I mean, birds, I see sparrows getting into everything.
Yeah, so that's kind of the research that I do. So, long story short, we have about 44,000 commercial poultry facilities in the U.S., another 20,000 plus dairies, and another 60,000 commercial swine facilities. Historically, the locations of those farms is based on, the cost of the land. You want inexpensive land to put a farm on. And you want it to be flat, because it's easier to work on that type of flatness. And then you also want proximity to railroad tracks, so you can ship corn and soy and eggs and meat back and forth. We've never really historically thought, unfortunately, about where these farms are relative to waterfowl habitat. So
and the migration route.
And all those things. So I'm from California, for example. We've lost 95% of our natural wetlands. So what that means for the millions of waterfowl that are present in the Central Valley of California, where we have 1,000 dairies and 600 poultry facilities, what that means is that we have a lot of suboptimal habitat where 6 to 8 million waterfowl every fall and spring are hanging out. One conceptual idea that myself and others are working on is how can we create and reflood habitat away from these facilities strategically, with the goal of reducing the potential for disease transmission between wild waterfowl, the primary reservoir of high-path AI, and commercial poultry and dairy operations. This is really important work. It's hard in the sense that we are actually reflooding some habitat in California, but we're not doing it strategically. Getting people to kind of think in that kind of ecosystem-based approach. I think as Americans, we want, quick solutions. So whenever I talk to any stakeholders, they want to know what the answer is. And I don't think there are short-term answers. I do think there are some middle to long-term answers. And I think one of the things that we need to do a better job of is strategically reflooding and recreating habitat, which we know how to do, away from some of these locations. If you have 1 million laying hens on a facility and you've got wetlands or lagoons right on that facility, all the lasers in the world aren't going to push those birds, and water cannons and things like that aren't going to push those birds off that land. But if we create habitat strategically away from that facility, then we can reduce the potential for disease transmission that way.
It's like no time like the present. Let's get started on that kind of stuff. I can't stand when you've got a good idea and it takes years and years and years to get taken off.
It's an interesting, just from my perspective, I'm a researcher, I'm a veterinarian also. I work with a lot of folks at the state and federal and industry level, and it is almost an exercise in psychology and behavior, trying to change the way that we approach the problem. So, we're 3+ years into this outbreak. We keep kind of doing the same thing over and over again and repackaging it one way or the other.
Yes.
We need to be a little more creative, in my opinion. And to that point, we need some new people to reconsider how we farm in some ways, right? So our dairy operations, for example, don't have any physical biosecurity. So birds just go in and out, and that's a real problem. Our lab does a lot of remote sensing using all kinds of different approaches, but we do have all kinds of data that show that the birds are moving. These waterfowl are going right into where these dairy cows are eating, and they can spread disease really easily that way. So there's ways to figure this out, but it's it'll take some changes in behavior on our side, which is easier said than done as humans.
I think, and you and I as veterinarians, we've all been to dairy farms as part of our training and things. I think we need to take the state and federal officials to a dairy farm. They don't realize what you and I realize when you walk onto it. They have no clue. They're in an office somewhere, probably a lawyer and no science background, and they're, okay, I'm sorry if I offended any lawyers, but we need more science people in legislation as opposed to...
It's a real problem.
Okay, so
it's a real problem. And whatever your politics are, that's not relevant for this, but I agree that we need more science people in kind of decision-making positions, and not just more veterinarians. We need more waterfowl biologists. We need more people that are epidemiologists. We even need more engineers, people that are architects, because we need to redesign kind of how we're doing this right now, or else we're just going to keep on cycling through this year after year. And that's when egg prices start going up, for example.
Well, and also one of my main things, I was on an AVMA committee, Council on Biologics and Therapeutics, and I don't like when we have a good idea and good discussion and then it gets tabled. It gets tabled down month and month and month. When are we going to actually reach a conclusion on this? I mean, enough talk, let's start doing. What if one of our listeners finds a dead bird? And I know that's kind of a general question, but I found one here in Sandoval. I found a dead cormorant on the driveway across the street. And I volunteer with the Clinic for Rehabilitation of Wildlife here, Crow. And I said, look, I'll bury this bird, but tell me, do you guys want to look at it and check it for avian flu? And their response was, oh, it's a cormorant, it doesn't affect them. So I know, that did not sound right to me. So what do people do when they find a dead bird?
Yeah, so great question, very practical. So let's say it's a backyard chicken, for example. Let's start there and kind of move to the wild bird. So if you have a backyard chicken that dies or is very sick, most states have diagnostic labs. So I'm from California. We have the California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab, which is part of our veterinary school. And for a nominal fee, in some states it's free, but for a nominal fee, you can get a whole necropsy or an autopsy done of that bird with the goal of figuring out why that bird died in order to protect the rest of your flock. The reason the state subsidizes it is because what happens if that backyard chicken had avian influenza or had virulent Newcastle disease? So these are the things where these are really important investments so we can protect the rest of our commercial poultry industry, which is, millions of birds, especially in your neck of the woods in the South. That's a huge and a very important investment because we need to protect our poultry industry. So you can call your veterinarian. Your veterinarian will at the minimum be able to give you the contact information for a diagnostic lab where you can submit those birds, figure out what they died from in order to protect the rest of your flock. It's amazing what they'll do. So for California, I think it's about $25. They will do literally thousands of dollars of diagnostic work, again with that goal of protecting our poultry industry. But the benefit to the backyard enthusiast is that you can actually help the rest of your flock, because sometimes there's nutritional diseases, or sometimes reproductive diseases, or sometimes, every once in a while we're dealing with something like we're dealing with now with avian influenza. But there's a lot of value in that, and the state and the university will work with you in order to protect the rest of your flock. So that's on that side. Now, if you have wild birds, like let's say you're just walking near a pond or something like that, and you see a dead wild bird, 100% don't touch the bird. I would, because now we're dealing with something that could potentially be what we call zoonotic. So that would be my first recommendation. Second recommendation, I would encourage you to call your state wildlife agency, State Department of Agriculture, and sometimes they'll say, hey, you'll say, I found a dead duck. It's in this pond. Here's where some dead birds are, and they'll go out and sample it. Sometimes they'll say, look, we already know that area is we have a lot of avian influenza in that area, for example, or whatever disease that we're dealing with, and they'll encourage you, if you can, to put gloves on, put a surgical mask on, double bag it and put it in the trash, right? That's so
Oh,
those are
okay.
kind of the range of options, but I 100% agree you should contact someone, because it's important to know and to help our agencies figure out where this virus is and where it's not. Um, to track it,
track
yeah,
it.
absolutely.
Right.
And that information actually I use as we do disease modeling. When that information is ultimately submitted, it ends up on the USDA's dashboard of wild bird surveillance. If it's positive, it'll end up on that board, and then I can use that to kind of help guide our risk assessment for the poultry industry in various parts of the United States.
So along with that, say my outdoor cat, say my barn cat brings home a dead bird. Okay, I guess it would matter then if, well, you got to watch the cat if there's any symptoms, but I don't think there's anything you could do preventatively unless you have the bird tested.
Yeah,
right?
so that's, supportive care if your cat was exposed to the virus, and you can have the bird tested to see what's going on. Cats are, a unique challenge because indoor-outdoor cats are at this interface of wildlife and then they're inside right next to our face.
Right.
So in a way that most dogs, for example, aren't. Backyard livestock and poultry, though, are kind of in that same boat where we interact with them, but wildlife interacts with them. And they are this kind of conduit of all kinds of diseases because wildlife will interact with them. We interact with our backyard domesticated animals, and there are all kinds of diseases. Rabies is obviously one that we think about a little, not as much in the United States, but there are all kinds of diseases that we interface with when we interact with our backyard animals. And this kind of conceptually, we call this One Health, is that we can't be healthy unless our environment, our wildlife, and our domestic animals are healthy. We don't live in a bubble. I think we all intuitively know that. So we are starting to train our vet students in this kind of One Health concept, and it makes all the sense in the world. I think your younger viewers will be like, well, that makes sense. Us older people maybe we're a little slower to that boat, but it makes a lot of sense. And actually, it's great being at a vet school like Davis because we have a medical school too, and we have these really interesting workshops that are really valuable for the vet students and the medical students that cross that One Health divide, whether we're dealing with rabies, avian influenza, COVID, et cetera, because ultimately these diseases affect more than just humans, and if we want to have humans that are healthy, ultimately we have to deal with the root cause, which is more of an ecosystem issue as opposed to just solely a human issue.
I love the marriage of human medicine and veterinary medicine. I don't know why it hasn't existed longer than it
agreed.
has. So many comparative things, especially I love comparative pathology. I just think it's so fascinating.
That's the fun part about vet med.
One other question we had from a viewer. So do you just feed chickens chicken feed?
Yeah.
Or 'cause I know friends of mine give theirs like fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, so that's a very, very common kind of question. So so let's start in the commercial world just as a reference point. So in the commercial world, feed is about 70% of your operating costs. So they have to be very efficient, and the most expensive part of feed is protein. They want to use just the right amount of protein. They don't want to go over because now they're spending some extra money. They don't want to go under because now the birds aren't going to grow at the rate that they need to grow at. But in a general sense, from a backyarder's perspective, if you have laying hens, when they're chicks, they get a chick starter feed. And that has lots of protein in it because we want our birds to get big, not as much energy. And then when they get 18 weeks or so, just a couple weeks before they start producing eggs, we want to switch them in a graded fashion from our chick feed to our layer feed. And our layer feed has high calcium for obvious reasons. The shell has a lot of calcium in it, and it has less protein but more energy because now they need tons of energy to kind of pop out an egg every 25 hours or so. So if you think about a laying hen eats about 120 grams of feed a day. and they need about 4.5 grams of calcium. Now, the people that are saying, "Oh, I'm going to give them fruits and veggies from our, kind of from our home," if they pop that up too much, then that 120 grams of layer feed, they're not going to eat all that. They're not going to get all the calcium they need, and that's when we start having nutritional issues. So what I always recommend, and I'm not a nutritionist, but what I always recommend is that I have like a 5% rule. So some people look at their backyard chickens and they want to give them chicken scratch and they want to give them fruits and veggies and things like that. I look at my dog and I want to give them all kinds of treats because she's very cute and all that. I don't look at chickens and think that they're super cute, but I get that that's a sentiment because I've talked to enough backyarders and they want to give chicken scratch and they want to give fruits and veggies. So I have this 5% rule. Don't go above 5% of their total diet, whatever the amount is. Don't go above 5% by weight of these kind of goodies, chicken scratch and fruits and veggies. So if we're giving, let's say, 100 grams, just to make the math easy, don't go above 5 grams of chicken scratch and or these other things combined. And now they get the enrichment. You get the joy of giving them something that they really enjoy. Black soldier fly larvae, whatever. Just don't go above that 5% rule. So we can take a good idea, giving these birds all these supplements, but just not go above a level so they start having a lot of reproductive problems.
In Ohio, when I'm back in Ohio, in the Cleveland area, it gets pretty cold in the winter. So do you have to up their energy requirements for food in the winter? I would think
that's also a very common question. So the answer is no, actually. So birds are actually really, really hardy. Because they're in a flock, they can huddle together.
So you don't put a heater in there.
No, and that's actually a really good question that you're asking that, because every year there are always some fires from people that kind of plug in a space heater and just forget about it, and I think we're anthropomorphizing in the sense that we think that they're going to get cold. Now, the commercial folks don't like cold because the birds now have to use more and more feed just to keep their internal body temperature at temperature.
Because it's all about production.
It's all about production for them. So, but I would say that especially in the wintertime, you want your coop to always be dry. You want the coop also, like if there's big gusts of wind, birds don't typically like wind very much, so you want to make sure that you've constructed your coop in such a way where you have good ventilation in the coop, but that ventilation, that crosswind, is going above the level of their heads. And if they can, if you have some, whatever structure that you've devised, if you've got 3, 4, 5 birds, and they're kind of shielded from wind and cold and wetness, they'll be warm even in those Ohio winters. Like you don't need space heaters. They'll just eat a little more and they won't make as many eggs, obviously.
What are and just 2 more questions. What's a common disease that they'll get that doesn't kill them? Isn't there one?
So I think probably the most, to your point, there's a disease called coccidiosis, which is a protozoal parasite. We don't get it, so it's not something that affects us. But as young chicks, sometimes you'll see some kind of diarrhea, some bloody diarrhea, and that's typically this kind of coccidiosis or cocci infection. Unless it's a really bad type of coccidia, or unless it's a really bad infection with coccidia, they typically recover. It just takes them a little longer to kind of get to where they need to go as far as weight and things like that. Now,
so you don't have to medicate them.
To your point, and we didn't talk about this, probably the number one thing you can do, this is also a pretty ubiquitous disease, just like Marek's disease. You can protect your birds from this really easily by using what's called a medicated starter feed. So when you're feeding your chicks, there's 2 different choices. You can feed them an organic starter feed. Again, high in protein, pretty lower in calcium compared to the layer feed. Or you can feed them a medicated starter feed, which is what I always recommend. And that has what we call a coccidiostat. So all it does is it just kind of keeps that coccidia population down a little, and because it's got a chemical in there.
Is it Albon? What do they
There's
put? A sulfa?
there's different types of them, and I can't remember all of them in all
curious.
honesty off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but what they do is they reduce the amount of coccidia to kind of a normal level, which now your birds aren't going to have diarrhea and they're not going to be poor doers and things like that. It's very commonly used. We don't have, so if we were talking about antibiotics, I would say, well, don't use antibiotics unless you need to because we're dealing with this antimicrobial resistance thing. This is not that same class of bacteria. This is a protozoa, which we don't deal with as humans, and it really helps from a welfare perspective and a production perspective and just a general bird happiness perspective. Your birds will be much healthier. Now, some people are very adamant. They don't want any, they want everything organic, which totally understand. And if that's the case, the way you would control for that is just by having good husbandry. So we talked about not allowing rain into your coop, for example, not having water splashing from your waterers, because when the birds shed in their poop, those protozoa, if you have a moist or a wet environment, that'll help those eggs kind of persist. And then the next birds will eat them, and then you're going to have this cyclical kind of outbreak, which can really be a real problem at some point. So at the minimum, do that. At the maximum, not most, but a good majority of backyard birds, just use the coccidiostat, which is in the starter feed, and then you should be, between those two things, you should be good.
That sounds like the best idea, really. And one other thing, so where do you get the chicks from? I mean, do you get them from, like you mentioned, hatchery? You don't get them in the mail. Like when you want to get bees, you can get bees through the mail.
No, you can get the chicks through the mail too. They do have mail order hatcheries.
You can.
Yeah, it's a thing. In Ohio in the winter, you can't do that because the shipping can cause problems, as you can imagine, in the cold. So there's seasonal, depending on where you live, and the U.S. Post Service will work with you on that, and your hatchery will work with you. The nice part about working with kind of large hatcheries is that most of those large hatcheries are part of what we call the National Poultry Improvement Plan, or NPIP. And the nice part about NPIP is that they are kind of overseen by a combination of the state and the poultry industry, with the goal of making sure that they're not carrying diseases like salmonella, for example, avian influenza, into when you order them. So I always recommend, when you're getting chicks, call your feed store and say, hey, are you buying chicks from NPIP approved hatcheries? And they'll probably be like, I don't know. And then you'll be like, okay, well, can you find out and get back to me? Because I really want to buy chicks that are healthy. And you're setting yourself up for the healthiest possible flock. If you're dealing with hatcheries that are part of that program, there's some very small, like you might be on Craigslist or something, like that, and you might want a very specific breed that maybe the hatcheries don't have. And many of those places will be part of NPIP too, because if they want to ship their birds across state lines, they need to. There's two ways to do that. And one, the easier way and the least expensive way, is to be part of that NPIP program. And then you, as the consumer, know, okay, these people are legit. They are making an effort people are walking through their facilities. They're doing some kind of tests for various pathogens. We've got a good partner here, as opposed to someone else that might not know what NPIP is or doesn't use NPIP. In that situation, you're kind of like, I hope my birds are disease free. So nothing's perfect, obviously, even the NPIP ones, but at least this kind of increases the probability that you're dealing with healthy birds.
Boy, there is so much to this. I mean, my producers who have been listening to this whole time, you guys, Joanne and Duke, this is incredible, isn't it? I mean, really, there is so, in Ohio, of course, we have a lot of farms, and there's chickens out back, quote unquote, but I'm guaranteeing you, I'm sure no one has an eighth of that knowledge of what we were talking about.
I actually have a question.
Okay.
We had chickens, and I would clean the eggs before eating them. But our neighbor has more chickens than we did, and they would clean them with special cloths. Is that an issue? Or I heard that they're not supposed to get wet.
Yeah, so you definitely don't want, and you'll see a lot of YouTube videos where people will dunk their eggs in water. Don't want to do that because the egg shell is porous, and you can actually push the bacteria into the egg. That's when you start having problems because that's the part that we consume. And if it gets into the yolk, that's like this very rich media. That's what we grow bacteria on in the lab. So if you have salmonella, E. coli, listeria, whatever, if it gets into that yolk and then you don't refrigerate the egg, because a lot of people just leave them out for whatever reason, cultural, whatever, then you can deal with an issue. CDC estimates that 1 out of every 10,000 eggs has salmonella enteritidis, or one of the salmonellas that make us sick in it. Now for backyard, so commercially in the U.S., the law is you have to wash your eggs. So the commercial poultry industry has sprayers, and they can do it in such a way that we're not driving bacteria in there. The rest of the world, so the United States, Japan, and Australia, I believe, wash their eggs as the rule. The rest of the world does not wash their eggs. So those of you that have traveled around the world, you see eggs that are unwashed, and you see eggs that are at room temperature, and it kind of makes you scratch your head. There's all kinds of reasons for that, including eggs have what's called a bloom or a cuticle on them. And that's like almost like a biofilm that has some antibacterial properties in it. So some people will say, look, including some countries will say, look, we're trusting that biological membrane. If we wash the eggs, we're actually wiping off that membrane. Yeah. So some people will say, let's keep the membrane on there, let's sell the eggs. And there's some science behind that, 100%. The problem is, I think sometimes people take that to an illogical conclusion. So they have their backyard egg, it's got poop on it, and they're like, oh, there's a cuticle on it, or the bloom, it'll be fine, right? And that's just not true in that scenario. Now, for backyard poultry owners, I recommend don't wash your eggs because there's just too much potential to drive bacteria in there. You should collect eggs every day and put them in the fridge. If your eggs, you shouldn't have that much feces ever on your eggs. So, just in a general sense, if you have more than 5% of your eggs that have feces on them, you're doing something wrong on the husbandry side. I always joke with people, there's 3 things we don't talk about in polite company: religion, politics, and if you should wash your eggs or not, because people get really passionate about it, and they're, you're going to get all kinds of comments from people now saying, I don't care what, Maurice says.
And raw diet.
Oh yeah,
put
that's
that
the
on
fourth.
the list too.
Yeah, you could add that. So my general sense is just keep things simple. If you have good husbandry and you collect your eggs every day, you shouldn't really have any feces on them. If you do have feces on them, especially if you have someone immunocompromised or you're giving your eggs to your neighbors, just get rid of them. There are ways, you can let the feces, if it's dry, you can take a piece of sandpaper and rub it off, and take a washcloth with some hot water and wipe it off. But I don't like, sometimes you'll see people that just want to wash eggs in all kinds of weird ways, and I think we're just getting way too complicated. If you do your husbandry right, your eggs will be, there's still going to be bacteria on them. We know where the egg comes from. But it's pretty harmless, especially if you stick it in the fridge. So I recommend for backyarders not to wash their eggs.
Wow. And before we go, one more thing. For people that want information, what is a good website? Is it CDC, or is there a group of poultry veterinarians they can check
so
out?
I'm at a university. So if you type in UC Davis and poultry, you'll get to our, and I can send you the link. You'll get to our Cooperative Extension Poultry website. We have a YouTube channel. In general, my general recommendation for folks is when you're looking for resources, I'm biased, but I'm at a university. Go to university websites, go to government websites. And the reason I say that is because, I'm not getting paid by company X or Y or Z to sell you apple cider vinegar to cure your chicken from avian influenza, right? So when you go on some of these websites and someone's telling you, buy this chicken or buy this magic elixir, buy this snake oil, The reality is that they obviously have a financial motivation. If I have a financial motivation, I have to disclose it. So,
Right.
you know, when you get, you know, what I'm, you know, keen on is making sure that I'm delivering science-based information. People can always reach out to me. I get emails all the time, and I like helping people. And unfortunately, you know, sometimes the answer is, we don't know. We know what doesn't work. Sometimes we know what does work, but you know, I think as humans, we always want some magical solution. And I get a lot of people that are suggesting all kinds of things, which the science doesn't suggest, but you know, some of them are just there to make a buck. Some of them also, you know, are want to believe something that the science doesn't suggest yet. So that's why I would always lean on the government / academic sites. We're wrong all the time, but at least if we're wrong or right, it's based on what we know.
And what kills me is, you know, if I look at something on Facebook where this person with a 4-month-old Great Dane had parvo, and I don't even know why I read the comments. I just don't. It just angers me so much. This is why we're doing the podcast. The misinformation and the dangerous misinformation is what scares the heck out of me.
100%.
Yeah. This has been this has been great. I'm looking forward to listening to this webinar when I'm walking the beach, because then, you know, you learn better by repetition.
Yeah.
And I've learned so much today. And Joanne and Duke, I think you would agree with me.
Okay.
Yeah, or getting the outside. But thank you so much, Dr. Pitesky. I know we went a little long, but it was so fascinating, and there was so much stuff, and I got all the answers to all my questions.
Well, thanks for reaching out.
So we will put on the podcast info about the websites and the YouTube channel, all that stuff, so that people, again, get correct information.
Well, thanks for having me.
So thanks, everyone, for joining us as usual. My co-host, Janet Novotny-King, will be back next week. But for now, it's Dr. Alice Novotny-Jeroman saying thanks for listening, kiss your pets for us, and tune in next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in today. We hope you learned some valuable information about making decisions about your pet's health.
And don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe on podcasts, because we love to have those likes. Thanks so much for listening.
That's actually really good.
Oh,
you could both go bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, yeah.
How about woof woof?
This episode of Speaking of Pets podcast was sponsored by Blue Buffalo Veterinary Diets. Love them like family, feed them like family.
Follow us on social at Speaking of Pets, and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The Speaking of Pets podcast is an SLA video production.